Life.Church created this podcast because we all need healthy conversations with real people. So this podcast is here to help you start conversations with your life group, friends, and family. Now, on to the show.
Welcome to the You've Heard It Said podcast. This is Jason.
And this is Allie.
And I think before we mention our big question this week, I just want to say Merry Christmas to everybody.
Yes, we hope you have a very great Christmas. And if you don't have a church to go to, we would love for you to come check out one of our Christmas services at one of our locations or online.
And as we release this episode, it's super Christmassy. But honestly, like if you're listening in July, Merry Christmas to you too.
Okay.
It just feels good to say, Merry Christmas. And I feel like Jesus would be cool with us celebrating his birthday any time of the year. You know what I mean?
Okay, is focusing on Christmas your way of avoiding this week's topic?
No.
Really?
No. It actually has a lot to do with our big question this week. So,
okay.
Christmas is this wonderful time of the year. It's full of joy, being with family, traditions, celebration, all the good food and stuff. Hopefully no snow, but maybe snow.
Hopefully snow.
But it also has this tendency to kind of stir some things up, and not that way for everybody every year, but it's a time of the year when we notice who's not around. We realize, oh my gosh, I have to tell my whole family that I lost my job. Or we wonder why we don't feel like everyone else does right now. And this 2020 Christmas in particular, I think pretty much all of us are either grieving something or know someone closely who's grieving something. And so, yeah, it does have to do with our topic.
Yeah, I see the connection. So I think the big question is, what is grief and how do we live through it? And this question came up after it just kind of felt like everybody that we were talking with was experiencing signs of grief.
Yep.
I mean, honestly, it's harder for me to even think of somebody who I know that doesn't have any signs of grief or some sense of loss this year.
Basically, if you're a human and you'd like more hope, this episode's for you. Or maybe you know another human. This episode is for them. So just send it to them and say, Merry Christmas, no matter what time of year it is.
Okay, I think you're avoiding again. But anyways, a few of us on the podcast have actually experienced some grief of our own lately, but none of us are pros. So we actually decided to bring back our therapist friend from season 2, Kay Gackle. Mm-hmm. And so I was emailing back and forth with her, and I realized that like all other humans in 2020, we just needed to hear her talk.
Yeah.
So I basically just sat down with her and I only asked her one question and I just listened. And I think that you're going to want to do the same thing. But before we listen to Kay, we actually wanted to play a few of your stories.
So when I was in the 4th grade, I lost my mom to a battle with breast cancer. And losing a parent at that age is so tough because you're old enough to understand the finality of what happened, but not old enough to really have any other perspective on grief. At least I didn't anyways, especially not of that magnitude. It just felt like a nightmare I would never wake up from. I couldn't see any end in sight. My world was so shook I would have dreams about my mom doing simple, mundane things like making me pancakes for breakfast, and that was it. And then I'd wake up and she'd still be gone. It was just an incredibly, impossibly difficult time of life. And people helped me and my brother and my dad through the grieving process in all kinds of ways. And everyone means well, I think, but not everything is super helpful. I had responses as short as, dang, that sucks, to just straight up avoiding me and being afraid to talk to me. And I think they were trying to give me space, but it just kind of felt like I had the plague.
When I got married, instead of putting my identity in being a child of God like I should have, I was wrapped up in being a wife. So when my husband filed for divorce, my world fell apart. I was so ashamed that I'd let my marriage fail that I hid it for months. I let my secret pull me away from my family, afraid they might think less of me. I didn't know who I was without him. I felt lost and alone, broken, unwanted, and unlovable, like I was damaged goods. I was so afraid no one would ever want me again, and that I would always be alone.
A few years ago, I was laid off from a job I loved about a week before Thanksgiving. And at the time, I definitely felt undervalued, felt betrayed by management. I felt like I'd lost a connection to my work family, that I was separated from all my future career prospects, things I'd really looked forward to. There's also financial uncertainty around how my family was going to live, since I was the sole income provider at that point. And it really robbed me of being able to enjoy the holidays, since Thanksgiving was the next week and Christmas was just a few weeks later.
So immediately following my miscarriage was a whirlwind of emotions and experience that I'll never forget. First of all, coming from a family where miscarriage really isn't a thing. So I felt very alone in all of it, not knowing anyone else who had experienced this. I felt, of course, grief over this loss of a life. You know, a loss is a loss no matter how early in a pregnancy. And going through all of the emotions of grief over not only losing a child, but grief that my body wasn't doing what it was designed to do. Shame that I had failed at what God had called me to become, a mother. That my body had failed me, had failed my husband. I wasn't really angry with God, but I just felt numb to it all.
I can't begin to articulate and express just the soul-crushing grief that I experienced when I lost my little brother, Matt. Even at 36, he was my little brother and just the person that had always been in my life. The fact that he wasn't in my day-to-day is just like trying to pull out threads of him that are woven into who I am. And there's an indescribable pain. It's also unbearably numb. And I didn't know that I could make it through a day if I were to continue to process how I can get through another 40 years of life. But without him.
Okay, as we were talking about grief, we know that you have so many good things to say. And so we wanted to have you on. And could you just tell me a little bit about grief? Like, what is it? What can we do about it? How can we help other people? Just tell me all the things that we know that you know about grief.
Okay. I do really love this topic because I feel like often we attribute grief to just being the death or a loss of a loved one, but the reality is it can be any sort of loss. Grief is at its core the deep sorrow that is caused by loss. And so under the umbrella of loss, there are lots of different things. It can be a sense of change. It can be a disruption. It could be a loss of a loved one, but it could be situational. Maybe you've moved. Maybe you had a school or a job change. Maybe you had a routine change. Or maybe it's relational. So maybe someone in your family is chronically ill, or you have a loved one that has a mental health disorder. Then you have the separations or divorce, remarriage, blended family, abuse, or neglect. Or it can be even unfulfilled dreams. So maybe you didn't get the job, or you didn't make the team, or you're not talented or skilled enough in one particular area. Maybe you've been rejected recently by a group of people. Maybe your parents aren't together, or maybe you've experienced infertility. The reality is, loss can look like many different things. Loss is often layered as well. So for instance, if you're going through a divorce, then not only is it the loss of marriage, but it's loss of time with your kids if you have them, loss of in-laws, loss of family future holidays, or dream trips that you've decided to take, or a home that you've built. And so sometimes a present loss can have all the future losses accompanied with it. And there's really no limit to the examples of loss because it's really all about how a person perceives his or her situation. So if a person thinks there is a loss, then grief can be present, even if others don't fully get it or agree with it. In fact, there's a term that Kenneth Doka developed, and it's called disenfranchised grief. And that's the grief when someone incurs a loss, but it can't be openly acknowledged or socially sanctioned or publicly mourned. And so some of the things we just listed might fall in that category. And so while most people would say, yeah, those are disappointing, we might not say they're worth grieving over. And so what this does is this says that there are different kinds of losses. And so sometimes we might even do this to ourselves. We might say our own loss isn't worth being that upset over. And so we'll miss it. We'll just keep going and we completely miss it. So what does it look like? How do we know if we're grieving, or how do we know if someone else is grieving? And so maybe as you listen to this, ask yourself, when was the last time I actually experienced any one of these things? Can you identify if you felt these? Maybe you've been on edge more, irritable or angry. Maybe you felt sad or down or felt like a weight is on you. Or maybe you have found yourself thinking about the loss more and more, so your thoughts are circulating about one thing a little bit more often than normal. Or maybe you have increased worry about something or someone else in your life leaving. Or maybe you felt numb or apathetic recently. So when you start to recognize some of those things, then you can look at the situations and your life events and say, man, have I experienced a loss? Has there been a sense of change or some disruption in my life that now I can really recognize I am actually grieving? And if you've ever actually grieved something, so oftentimes people will say, well, when will this be over? Like, how will I know I'm to the end and when am I through this? And the reality is there's no playbook. There's no timeline. It's not this pretty little line that you go through and you get to the end. There's not stage 1 and stage 2 and you find this eventual elusive closure. And so a lot of times people will ask about the stages of grief. And this is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, and she identified denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And these were written in her text called Death and Dying. And it was from her work when she worked with terminally ill patients. And so rather than these being steps that you go through, it was more what people commonly experienced at the end of life. She didn't mean stages of grief as in you move from one to the next to the next. It was just things that you might experience as you're grieving. And so when you have a family unit that experiences the same loss, people might do one of these, two of these, all of these, and they're going to do them at different times and in different ways. And so you can see how there's a lot of friction that can occur or frustration because people think it should look this way, or we want a timeline, or we want it to be in this nice little pretty box. But your denial could look like maybe you're resisting the reality of loss, or maybe your depression is you don't even want to get out of bed. Maybe you might be really angry, or maybe you're the one that wants to fill in the if only I had statements. And so just kind of knowing that these are common things that people experience when they're grieving can kind of help ourselves and other people as they start to navigate some of this. So what can we do with the people in our lives that are experiencing grief? Well, the reality is we can give them a huge gift by simply being with them. And we often describe this as a roller coaster, right? Because in one moment they can be deep sorrow, then they can laugh, and then they can change the subject, and then they can be angry, and then they can laugh again, or then they can be sad. And it does often feel like it's all over the place. So like a roller coaster. And what we can do is we can offer empathy. We can acknowledge their experience and loss. We can listen to them. We can cry with them, and we can laugh with them. Sometimes we can simply be with them, and our presence is enough. But we can also help them by avoiding having our own agenda for them. If we don't try to move them along from their sadness, we don't have to have an answer for their why questions or their if-only statements. Not minimizing what happened to them or offering another perspective. We don't have to try to make them feel better. And knowing that their experience isn't about us. So not jumping in when they share about their loss and immediately saying, oh, I know exactly how you feel. This is what happened to me. But just sitting with them in that moment And it can be really uncomfortable when you're sitting across from somebody who is sobbing or is really angry in their grief. It can be really uncomfortable in that moment. And I think we all tend to want to just have some comfort to offer. We want to make them feel better and ourselves feel better. And so we end up saying very painful statements like, there's a reason for everything, or I know exactly how you feel, or be strong, or God never gives you more than you can handle. This must be a part of God's plan. Or look all you could be thankful for. I've heard that one. Or they're in a better place now. But to the hurting person, that can be even more hurtful, because even if they logically agree, what you're saying is that their present hurt shouldn't hurt, and that truth should simply make it okay that it happened. But what I've found is that people get there on their own, and they do it better and healthier and quicker if we don't push them, but instead we acknowledge their loss, we acknowledge their experience, and we're just simply present with them. So simply saying, I am so sorry, and being with them is the most helpful thing you can do. You don't have to have the magic words to comfort them. They don't really exist anyway. And sometimes people need professional help. They want that. And so you can normalize this and say, man, if you want to go to therapy, it's okay. It's very normal for people who are grieving. And here's a trusted person I know, or here's a trusted counseling center I know. And you can go the extra step and you can connect them with those people that you already know. And that can help with them in a time that they're feeling very overwhelmed, not to feel so overwhelmed about taking that step for themselves. So grieving any kind of loss is very, very hard. But for ourselves and others, it's so important to acknowledge the loss, be attuned to how it's being experienced, knowing that you're going to experience it in different ways than other people, and then just giving yourself the space and the grace to just navigate all of that.
You know that moment when something big, bad, or sad happens in your life? Or maybe you just watch some totally sappy but great movie, and all of a sudden you realize that only a few things in life really matter. And none of them are actually things, but more like people and relationships. So we think a life group is a place to find those people. And if you don't already have that, would you just think about joining or starting a life group at www.Life.Church/lifegroups.
Honestly, the people who helped me the most were the people who were just honest. They just asked how I was doing and then listened. They'd sit in silence with me if need be. They wouldn't try to fix me or read me a list of helpful things. They were just there. And sometimes they'd ask if I wanted to do something like go ride bikes or hit golf balls, and that was great too, because I think my friends and family who were really helpful understood that you can experience joy and grief at the same time. And sometimes you need to remind yourself that you can still have fun, that you're allowed. And I think God meets you there, because that grief and that joy are both such deeply human things. And you need to remember it's okay to experience both.
So I think initially people mean well, but it's hard to know exactly what to say when someone is grieving, especially if it's a grief process that maybe you're not as familiar with. So I remember comments that were meant for good actually stinging. So comments like it's all in God's timing, or miscarriage is common. It happens to a lot of women. So those comments that are meant to comfort were actually not what I needed to hear. So some great things that people did do for us, though, and do for me, was like our life group surrounding us in prayer, and so many loved ones bringing us food to our doorstep, and just allowing time for my husband and I to go through the grief process together and create an open environment for me to talk and just cry, which is really what I needed most.
I spent a lot of time just staring at walls and processing. And God showed up through people in amazing ways. And some of them would just grab me and hug me and pull me out of it. Others would just come and sit down next to me and stare at the wall with me. And others would share stories I found a large body of people who loved my brother and loved me just because I was related to my brother. And I also had those people who were just genuinely good people that loved me and wanted me to be healthy and to know that they loved me and that they were there for me. Just be willing to talk about that person, because anybody going through grief who has fond memories of their loved one wants to hear stories. They want to talk about them. They want to share stories. And years later, they'll want to hear stories from other people, because those are experiences that they never got to have themselves. And it still breathes life into the person who's just not walking with us anymore. But people are pretty awesome if you allow them to be a part of that process. And for those that don't know what to say, well, just sit still and just be there with the person. You don't really have to say a whole lot. It's just your presence matters.
Over the next few weeks, I definitely heard from a lot of people. Some suggested that I should just settle for whatever first came along. Some thought they had it worse and thought that was helpful to hear. But a lot of coworkers did reach out, shared that they thought I was a valuable team member, gladly connected me with contacts at other companies. I had family that offered to help support us during that time and offered a safety net if things got too bad before things got better.
Thank God for my women's life group. They were the only ones who knew how much I was struggling. They sat with me, cried with me, took my calls no matter what time it was, brought me food to make sure I was eating. And they didn't try to give me advice, but encouraged me to listen for God's direction. They called out the lies I was telling myself and constantly reminded me who I am in Christ. I'll never forget how they were there for me when I needed them most.
So when Kay said the things about with them, that for me just kind of stuck out. And I was thinking about the times where people have come alongside my family when we were hurting. And I don't know, just something about that stands out to me. So I don't know, how did that hit for you?
Yeah, so that one really stuck out for me too, because I think we mentioned it earlier, but a lot of us on the podcast have actually experienced a lot of grief this year. So recently, my husband and I had our second miscarriage, and so we definitely are familiar with grief. But the with them thing I think is so special, because I think that we really got to see our people come alongside us and be with us. And so I remember the day that we found out, we texted our life group, and immediately the text thread kind of blew up, and everybody was saying just really kind things and saying that they were praying for us and asking what they could do. And then I get individual texts from all of the different people in our life groups. They're texting me again to say what can I bring you? What can we do? How can we help? And so it was just so sweet. And then I'm just thinking about that. And then all of a sudden, another girl in my life group texts me and just says, hey, me and the girls in our life group are on our way to your house right now. And you don't have to come out if you don't want to, but we're just going to pray in your driveway. And so I go out to the driveway, and my friends are there. And they didn't have magic words like Kay was talking about. They just cried with me, and they prayed with me. And I have never felt more loved than in that moment.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So the scripture that actually you chose, I think, for this episode is Romans 12:15. And I'll just read it because I think it sums up your story. It says, be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. Okay, so I'm going to take a turn.
I would expect nothing else.
I was on this online book study last night, which is just a funny thing to do.
An online book study?
With 30 different people from across the country and the author of the book, okay?
Okay.
It was an online book study about grief and loss. And I invited my buddy who's from across the country, and he's on. And we went to school together, starting in second grade. We're lifelong best friends. And like all of a sudden it's like back to being in like third grade again, where like the teacher's talking and we're like making eyes at each other. And we started like this text thread between, I mean, we were taking it seriously, but also like trying to deal with it, I think maybe. So we're texting back and forth like GIFs or GIFs or however you say that, and jokes and stuff. And then all of a sudden, like he would get me so bad and I'd have to like turn my screen black because I'd be like belly laughing. And at one point I was laughing so hard, I was literally crying and slapping my knee.
So you're just like cracking jokes while everybody else is talking about grief and loss?
Right. So yes, I feel like we did that verse though. Like we were being happy with each other. I know this is a stretch, but it was also a way that we were kind of grieving together. He's going through some tough stuff, and it just was like a way to let off the steam. And so I think sometimes we think of grief and we're like, it's just got to be heavy all the time. But like sometimes the being with someone is laughing. Sometimes it's distracting them for a little bit. You know, we don't want to avoid the issue, but a little distraction's okay. So yeah, like we were just having fun, like we were kids. And I think it was the exact healing that we needed, you know, in that moment, which is also something I feel like Kay talked about, that grief is going to be different for everyone. And actually she was going through her list of things and she's like, you might be grieving if, and she had like this list, right?
Right.
And I find myself sitting there in my little black folding chair with my eyes closed, because I'm sitting and listening to you interview her. And I'm checking off every box. And I'm like, no. And then she says, and you might be grieving if you find yourself worrying that you might lose something else. So when she said that, I realized I have been worried about losing something else. And all the loss of 2020 just starts running through my mind. And I'm like, wait a second, Kay, I have questions.
I remember. So then we actually asked Kay if she would answer one more question for us. And so we kind of just asked her like, hey, Kay, do you think that all 2020 humans right now are maybe actually grieving this year? And I think you should just listen to her response, because I think there's going to be something in there for you that maybe you won't even expect, but it's going to be really good.
2020 doesn't leave anybody out of the grieving box, right? We can all sort of recognize when we have felt some of these things, or we've seen it play out and being angry or irritable or more stressed than we are, or thinking about how this is going to play out for us. And so what we do is we take all of these things that we want to apply to other people and we ask ourselves, how can I not have myself have an own agenda? How do I let myself sit in the pain and not have to move myself from the sadness that like things are really chaotic and crazy, and there's a lot of upheaval that we've all experienced, even if it looks different than what our neighbor has experienced. And so how can I do that for myself? How can I just tell myself, man, this is really, really hard, period, and not have to move on from that and just sit in it for a hot second before we have to fix it all? How do we let ourselves grieve so that we can keep going? Because that's really the question. And it's not that grief isn't going to exist. It's more of, what are we going to do with it? How will we unfold it into our lives and let it become a part of our story, and not something that's in another box somewhere in a shelf in a closet that we never open again? How do we let that be a part of our lives? And what does that look like?
Well, I definitely needed that.
Me too. I think we all needed that. To finish this week, I thought that I would read something from Audra, one of our storytellers. She actually lost her dad early this year, and she came across this poem by Tess Guinery that's been really helpful to her. So we're just going to end on that poem. I know it's been dark for the longest of whiles. What you are learning here can only be taught here. The truth found here can only be revealed here. Be here. Sow your tears here. And when the moonlight rises to full, bloom here.
Thanks for listening to the You've Heard It Said podcast. Christmas is right around the corner, and we'd love to invite you to experience it with us at one of our Life.Church locations or at Life.Church online. We'll include links to our service times in the conversation guide, along with questions, resources, and more to help you turn what you've heard into a meaningful conversation with your life groups, friends, and people you care about. And a great Christmas present for us would be a rating and review. So if you have a second, we'd really appreciate it. Anyway, Merry Christmas and have a great week.